Good evening, SCI-Arc. Good evening, esteemed guests and friends of SCI-Arc. And good evening greetings to our audience, online, present and future. My name is Namik Mackic. I'm the research program manager here at SCI-Arc and also an organizer of this exhibition, Views of Planet City, within the context of which we are organizing tonight's event, one in a series of public programs accompanying the exhibition. It's SCI-Arc's contribution to PSD Art and Science Collide, presented by Getty. And to tackle an elephant in the room right away, you know that scene in The Matrix where Neo visits the Oracle for the first time? And she tells him not to worry about the vase before he knocks it over? If we'd known how this presidential race would pan out, would we have organized this event the day after the election? The answer is yes. I can hardly think of a better time to get together to talk about how not to resign, but to go in there and pry open the whole spectrum of possible futures. And I don't mean to be flippant here, but the social drama that seems to be arising out of all this may just be the appropriate kind of response to the wider horizon that the world is headed towards. But let's take the local context first. In his world-building project, Planet City, Liam Young envisions a single city into which all the peoples of the earth agree to retreat against the apocalyptic horizon of climate collapse. The exhibition Views of Planet City constructs a maze of perspectives on this scenario from 5 very different artists who, through their explorations, render this virtual city a material phenomenon and a cultural event already in a process of becoming. With all 5 artists having originally trained as architects, the show is, among other things, also a demonstration of what we might call architectural futures, not to be construed as simply future articulations of architectural form, but rather architecturally considered stagings of the assets of the future. And so I'll click you through the installation shots. Whether you have seen the show or not, currently on view at Pacific Design Center Gallery and SCI-Arc Gallery, tonight's speakers will provide multiple corrective lenses through which to view the show, hopefully giving a crisper image of what's at stake. By way of introduction, allow me to outline a framework that brings tonight's speakers together. Staging futures, exhibition making, and design as a speculation apparatus sets up a relationship between 2 fields of production. On one hand, architectural futures, understood as specifically architectural contributions to the landscape of futures thinking. And on the other hand, exhibition making, and by extension, the whole gamut of narrative environments and experience design as a critical infrastructure for the conjuncture we find ourselves at. When futures and narrative environments, with their attendant methodologies, intersect, they outline a type of medium design. This is the titular speculation apparatus, an open-ended notion where we are tasked with wiring up fresh and ingenious loops between speculative thinking, a practice that extends across time, cultures, and media, and design. And I'd argue Keller-Easterling's characteristically elusive term, medium design, obtains in this case a solid framework of historical references and performance criteria. How should a speculation apparatus operate? What goals should it serve? What does it take to design it well? What should an encounter with the future feel like? Let me sketch out this problem by way of an analogy. You can sense her presence long before you enter. It is already inscribed in the expectation that made you seek her out in this remote place. But it escalates as you draw near. You'll pass through an underground chamber to access the site. Standing on a clearing facing the sea, between 2 parts of a ruined acropolis, you'll spot an aperture to the left, the profile an elongated hexagon. As you step inside and proceed towards the innermost crypt, your walk is framed by walls made of blocks of volcanic rock. If you happen to arrive at sunset at the peak of summer, you'll be crossing patches of sun rays falling on the darkened walls through the regularly placed apertures. The Cumaean Sibyl resided here, in Campi Flegrei, northwest of the Bay of Naples, where it was widely believed lay an entrance to the underworld. She performed divinations by reading constellations of leaves after inhaling fumes from the surrounding volcanic fields. Her sanctuary, a link to the chthonic deities. When I reached the crypt at the center of the cave, dry leaves were dancing in the currents of air trapped inside. Future for the ancient Greece was plural, a kaleidoscopic blend of cosmically preordained and negotiable fate, governed by gods and stirred into motion. It stirred into motion options through the oracular act of divination, which turned it into a spectrum of options for action. In a contemporary speculation apparatus, the speculator architect acts, if not as a Sibyl-like diviner, then as a catalyst for a dramatic experience of intersecting perspectives, which brings us to our final keyword, staging. Staging as a strategy that within contained margins explore the dramatic performance of parameters such as distance, proximity, sequence, direction, timing, and rhythm. In views of Planet City, each of the 5 bodies of work rely on specific models of manipulating information in their pursuit of architectural futures, each with their own formal and narrative strategies and their own attitude of engagement with emergent and evolving technology. Liam's Young Planet City is a spectacular inversion of the discourse of planetary urbanization, a consolidated city for all humankind, the problem of the urban crunched into an oracular riddle for us to divine, the collective guilt of urbanization ecstatically overcome. Jennifer Chen works in her now established genre of projective mythography. She puts forward myths of the future. An anti-Noah parable about a collective movement to escape the flood in anticipation of a new world to come. Damjan Jovanovic stages a virtual encounter and conversation with a synthetic intelligence, the scale of an ecosystem. Angelica Lorenzi dreams up a messianic wilderness at the periphery of Planet City as a way of beckoning us to look for the feral in ourselves and in the technologies of rewilding. And John Cooper sketches out a path of coordinated actions from the disassembled to a reassembled city as a recipe for the coming into being of a new humanity. In these works, staging of futures translates into anticipatory praxis, a critical cultural infrastructure for the age of transitions, where we as an audience can imagine moving from confabulating futures to committing to collective futures. In this context, to seek to give the collective act of anticipation a mise-en-scène, a critical infrastructure for, a space we can share and traverse with other people, is a profoundly hopeful act. And I'm delighted to introduce to you tonight's speakers, who will be doing consecutive presentations, after which we will do a panel discussion here on stage. Adam Bandler is a designer, educator, curator, and co-founder of Oficina.LA, a Los Angeles and Mexico City-based architecture office. As former assistant director of exhibitions at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, he has co-curated and designed numerous exhibitions in the US and abroad. He has also collaborated with several artists as an exhibition designer, notably with Tony Arsler. Adam is a lecturer in history and theory at Otis College of Art and Design, previously consultant for the USC School of Architecture, and adjunct assistant professor of architecture at Columbia University, GSAPP. He holds an MS in critical curatorial and conceptual practices in architecture from Columbia University and a B.Arch from SCI-Arc. Doris Berger is a curator, scholar, and author. Vice President of Curatorial Affairs at the Academy Museum, she oversees the museum's curatorial department, shapes the overall exhibitions program with leadership, and curates exhibitions. She was previously a Getty postdoctoral fellow, a curator at the Skirball Cultural Center, and a director of the Kunstverein Wolfsburg, Germany. Her curated exhibitions include Light and Noir, Exiles and Emigres in Hollywood, 1933 to 1950 at the Skirball, and at the Academy Museum, Stories of Cinema, Backdrop, and Invisible Art, Regeneration Black Cinema, 1898 until 1970, Isaac Julian, Baltimore, and finally, Cyberpunk, Envisioning Possible Futures Through Cinema, part of this year's PSD Art as well. Berger earned a PhD in art history from Braunschweig University of Art, Germany, and an MA in Romance Studies and Art History from the University of Vienna, Austria. Samatha Culp is a writer, filmmaker, and cultural strategist based in Los Angeles after a decade in Greater China. Her work focuses on the changing flows of global culture, the shifting creative economy, and mobilizing storytelling for social change. Her writing has appeared in publications such as Wired, The Atlantic, Art in America, and MIT Technology Review. For Netflix, she produced the documentary series The Confession Tapes and Exhibit A, focused on wrongful convictions and how they reveal America's flawed justice system. She is currently writing a nonfiction book for Crown Publishing about the global history of the future as a cultural concept and its transformation into a commercial industry. And finally, Nora N is a critic, essayist, curator, and educator based in Los Angeles. She is currently Arts Council professor at UCLA in Design Media Arts, previously a professor in digital and media at Rhode Island School of Design. Her writings on philosophy of AI and emerging technologies and the future of creative production in a technocratic age are referenced heavily across fields. Formally, her work attempts to theorize the limits of algorithmic knowledge and locate computation's influence on critical language. Her books are AI Art and the Stakes for Art Criticism, Seeing, Naming, Knowing, and Fear Indexing the X-Files with Stephen Warwick. She's a member of the curatorial ensemble of the 2026 edition of Counterpublic, one of the nation's largest public civic exhibitions, focused next on near futures. She was a co-curator with Andrea Bellini of the Biennale de l'Image en Mouvement 2024, a cosmic movie camera hosted by Centre d'Art Contemporain Genève and curated manual override at the Shed. Khan was a longtime editor at Rhizome, served as guest editor of Holo, producing the well-received Mirror Stage Between Computability and Its Opposite, and as editor in residence at Topical Cream. Khan was nominated for the John R. Frazier Award for Excellence in Teaching at RISD. So the sequence of presentations will begin with the mechanics of exhibition architecture, both exhibition apparatus, both as a conceptual and architectural design problem. Then we segue to Berger's presentation of an exhibition and exhibition design specifically tackling cinematic speculations about the future. The third presentation by Samatha Culp situates us in a global landscape of futures thinking, while the final one by Nora brings us back to exhibition as both a site and a model for reflexive engagement with futures. After the four presentations, we will take a very brief break for the stage shift. Well, it's actually already prepared, and then we'll sit down together for a panel discussion, which I hope you will stay for. Please join me in welcoming to the stage the first speaker, Adam Bandler.
Thank you, Namik, and it's such a pleasure to be back at SCI-Arc. As a graduate in 2008, this is the place where my education was formed, where I met my wife and current business partner, Jessica Rivera, and also our other business partner, who I met in the student union, Gregory Van Grunsven, who's here today. Many thanks, Namik, to Liam, to the entirety of the SCI-Arc administration for entrusting our firm, Oficina.LA, with the design and realization of this really exciting exhibition. I want to take a second and say that none of this would have been possible without SCI-Arc students. Too many to name, you can maybe see their names here, for their tireless energy and skill in helping to realize the show. Everything that was done was developed between our office and SCI-Arc as an institution. I want to give a very special thanks to Max Lorenz for his just relentless dedication and intelligence to this project. He spent his whole summer here working with our office to design, test, fabricate, and install the projects, cajoled every student helper, managed almost all of the logistics, something like 1,800 3D printed parts, 2,500 feet of steel, and countless miles of 3D printed filament. It's a unique experience to design an exhibition with the School of Architecture. And I've worked with the Arthur Ross Architecture Gallery at Columbia University for nearly 10 years, doing as much. Well, I could speak for hours about exhibitions and their responsibilities to culture, politics, and the innumerable disciplines with which they engage. I'd like to reduce this talk to a discussion about something very basic: the spatial and material techniques of display and engagement, as one of myriad answers to Namik's prompt for this panel. As Namik wrote when he proposed this to the four of us, quote, "How can the apparatus of an exhibition or a spectacle in any tactile or immersive medium facilitate encounters with the engagement, with the emergent, and invite audiences to engage with futures?" So to speculate on this, as I was trained, we looked to historical practices and the various apparatuses of cinematic production central to the content of every artist featured in this exhibition. So we narrowed it down to 5 aspects: the set, the lighting, the camera, the narrative, and the audience. As shocking as it may sound, architecture schools don't typically have the budgets of major Hollywood studios. So we had to be quite clever in designing the system that we eventually deployed. The typical tools, the Manfrotto tripods, the speed rail pipe and clamp systems, professional dollies and cranes and lighting rigs, sound booths, etc., were absolutely out of the question. Instead, we took lessons from the architecture, the flexible and modular building systems deployed in the production of cinema, and designed a very simple pipe and clamp assembly using ready-made steel, 3D printed parts, and of course, the McMaster catalog. 48 individual parts were designed and prototyped and manufactured at SCI-Arc, over 1,800 produced in total, bolted over 2,500 feet of pipe with 20,000 plus bits of hardware. These pieces were used to light the galleries, display the objects, delineate the different spaces, provide sound insulation, and most importantly, provide cohesion to 5 artists exhibiting in multiple mediums across 2 galleries separated by 13 miles of Los Angeles traffic. So we'll start at the PDC. The building itself is a near perfect cube, 2 floors with ceiling heights at 12 feet on the ground floor and 15 to nearly 34 feet on the second floor. You can see the shape of the ceiling and probably very quickly understand the difficulty of light control and audio fidelity given the abhorrent geometry of the space. Abhorrent for the sake of an exhibition, that is. While a perfect square should be easy, it's arguably the most difficult space I've encountered in displaying media. The ground floor is divided into 4 distinct zones: the entrance, the gallery, circulation, and service. And it's here we designed what we call the research station, replete with the didactic texts introducing the audience to the project, and 4 documentaries about the research and inception of the project. But 3 other objects that I would like to discuss: 2 3D printed models by Liam of the stacked housing of Planet City, a mask used in the production of Planet City, and the studio lights that we designed illuminating the space in the ubiquitous pinkish light of all of the participants' projects. Detail 1 of that plan: the 5-axis film rig. It was designed to achieve what we think are some of the most interesting architectural shots in cinema, and ubiquitous and ever-present in Planet City: the vertical tracking shot, the horizontal tracking shot, and the fixed position pan and zoom. 3 references here of the films that motivated our design. At the top, Yo Soy Cuba, filmed at the Havana Hilton, of a vertical tracking shot from a rooftop dance party down to an inside of a swimming pool. Weekend, of course, with this impossibly long, kilometers-long tracking shot of a traffic jam in France. And finally, Rear Window, Alfred Hitchcock's masterpiece, my favorite Hitchcock film, where the entire set was designed around a single point. The entire narrative revolves around one man in a wheelchair recovering from an injury and filming a murder mystery from his chair. If exhibitions are pedagogical projects, as I believe and Namik prompted in this abstract, then that education is twofold. One, to teach an audience about the context of the exhibition, and two, to teach the audience how to apply that to reading the content of the work. This is where the film rig comes into play. It allows a visitor to interact with the apparatus of cinema, to replicate the shots seen in the various films, and to make their own short narratives. To do this, we designed what we call the 5-axis film rig, seen here. It's made up of two components. One, the camera, and two, a real-time connection to a screen. Using polished stainless steel and linear ball bearings, let me get this. Using polished stainless steel, linear ball bearings, 3D printed carbon fiber connections, and a counterweight, we designed a balanced arm that can track horizontally, as in Godard's Weekend, vertically, as in Yo Soy Cuba, and with a smooth action to capture both the height and width of the model. While tracking, or when in a fixed position, we designed a gimbal mount so that the camera can pan plus or minus 30 degrees, horizontally or vertically, replicating the shots of Hitchcock's film. Finally, the camera itself can zoom, fade, and focus. Though the camera is digital, all of the actions are mechanical, creating a hybrid type of filmmaking less evident though ever present in Liam's film, which uses CG but also features real humans engaged in real life. The third rig that appeared on site was a fixed camera in a fixed position, elevated like a surveillance camera to capture the audience participating with the pieces. Here we go, sorry. And the term, I think, of art is breaking the fourth wall, revealing the audience participating in the construction of this particular narrative. As at the PDC, the images from these cameras are broadcast back to SCI-Arc, completely disembodied and appearing as if they're a part of the Planet City film itself, or perhaps some surveillance of the city of Liam's imagined future. Albeit in a more limited way, the documentaries are also shown at the SCI-Arc Gallery to introduce the audience to the responses by the other two artists, Angelica and John, featured, well, here. This is, you can see the images from the film rig projected behind John's film in the SCI-Arc Gallery. So back to this PDC and the 5 points that I brought up about the stagecraft of both filmmaking and exhibitions. Here, I want to talk about the lighting from detail D3 in the drawing. While the 5 projects are totally disparate in medium, content, and narrative, all pick up on a key environmental feature of Planet City, the ubiquitous ethereal pink glow. The lighting at the PDC is extremely difficult to work with, and this is a very important point to my job as an exhibition designer, but to exhibitions more broadly. It's a 1970s track system with no dimmers, much less any modern lighting controls. So to remove visitors from the harsh reality of the existing par lamps with their blinding orange glow, and to transport them into the space of the Planet City, we developed our own studio lamp. The lamp also seen here at the SCI-Arc Gallery. Troping on the pieces of the artist, we developed this lamp, a single LED tube behind a purple gel to illuminate the space and bring the audience into the world we're trying to build. Again, using 3D printed components, 1-inch black pipe, and simple off-the-shelf connectors, we created 2 models, a freestanding and a wall-mounted sconce. These lamps serve to set the tone of the exhibition and also guide the audience on a designated pathway through the exhibition. Which brings me to the third piece of cinematic production, the narrative. Central to Liam's film is a procession of revelers dressed in a kind of quasi-spiritual garb who move through the city in a celebration of the planet in which that they helps to save. As one moves from the first floor research station to the second floor, this procession is also recreated, a graphic novel and the lights and the masks that track, like the film rig, up the staircase. When we were initially presented with this project, the masks were shown to us in Liam's studio, sitting on top of Manfrotto tripods. Given the nature of the project, and as I've discussed, we felt that this was really interesting, that the costumes were being presented, again, through the technologies of cinema. Mannequins, though museological standards of display of costumes, seemed super banal. And so the question became, how do we show these masks with dynamism, with flexibility, in order for them to convey the narrative that they represent? So this. As Namik said, I live primarily in Mexico City. And one night, after getting the commission for this project and looking out my window, I found the answer. It was a procession through the city, up Reforma, not dissimilar from that found in Liam's film. It's called the Semana Santa, in which a crucifix is paraded through the city. Not to talk too much about Christianity, but the crucifix is an amazing object. It's a kind of form of human proportion. It symbolizes both life and death, and is this thing that performs what I believe to be this quasi-spirituality of Liam's film. And so we designed, in the spirit of the procession and the spirit of the Manfrotto tripod, this flexible display for the masks. Again, you can see what that looks like here. And again, a variation of that, displaying Angelica's tapestry here in the SCI-Arc gallery. So as I hinted at, and I'm going to go quickly, Namik, I'm sorry, there are a lot of problems exhibiting at the PDC. One, showing 3 different types of film. You see Planet Garden, Damjan's film, and of course the video game, Liam's film, and Jennifer's film. Because the acoustics are so bad, we needed a way to isolate both light and sound. And so, in the spirit of the site in which we found ourselves, we designed what we called the disco cube, boxing out the alcove above the central part of the gallery, and then putting Pink Earth and Planet Garden left and right. What that looks like. Still, we had the problem of light and sound. And so again, appropriating the tools and technologies of cinema, we used light reflectors, and thank you, Reflective Concepts, for your generous in-kind donation of many of these things, acoustic foam, and the pipe and clamp system that we had developed for the other apparatuses in the show. This enabled us to do 2 things. One, to use the ambient light of the projections of the monitors to illuminate the space and thus eliminate the problem of the track lighting. And 2, to provide some level of sound insulation between 3 different time-based works. You can see a little bit here with all the house lights on, what that looks like, but then also how it transforms based on the content being projected onto the wall across the way. So we have blue, pinkish, purple, red, and in the end leads us to this, which is the interior of the cinema, which again, responding to the grid, ubiquitous in every single one of the projects, expresses itself on the interior. Namik, I have like 10 more minutes, but I'm gonna leave it there because I think I'm past time.
Thank you, everybody, and good evening. And thank you, Namik, for inviting me to participate in this evening. And thank you, Liam, for creating this exhibition, Planet City. That's the reason why we're all here. I have the pleasure to talk to you about an exhibition I curated at the Academy Museum in Los Angeles that you see here in some pictures. And as Planet City, this exhibition is called Cyberpunk, Envisioning Possible Futures Through Cinema, is also part of the Getty PSD Art and Science Collide program. So big thanks to the Getty to include us into this big adventure together. I curated this exhibition together with colleagues, the assistant curators Nicholas Barlow and Emily Rauber-Rodriguez, that you see on the right of the pictures. And we have worked with an advisory group of scholars and filmmakers from Canada to Kenya. And we see two scholars here in the middle of us, Akira Lippitt and Patrick Sharp, both from Los Angeles. But let me give you some background about the ideas for the exhibition first, and then dive deeper into the different aspects of the show. From a curatorial perspective, so we are shifting perspectives here basically from an architectural perspective into a curatorial perspective, but nevertheless, the collaboration with our design team at the Academy Museum was really intrinsic into making this exhibition. We had uncountable, wonderful hours together, crazy hours together. And this intro wall that you see before you enter the exhibition was designed by Emily Tobias, who created all the graphics for the show. Brief overview of the exhibition. The show examines the origins, the global impact, and lasting influence of cyberpunk on cinema culture. Cyberpunk films, as you most of all know, is a science fiction subgenre that features near-future scenarios set in worlds that eerily resemble our own. They often juxtapose technological advances with social disorder, ecological crises, and urban decay. Central to these stories are rebellious characters who fight against corrupt political systems, global maker corporations, and oppressive regimes. So the focus of the show is really cinema, cyberpunk cinema, less so than video games or books or all the other cultural expressions of cyberpunk that there are, because there are many, and I want to acknowledge that here. And I'm sure we'll talk about that more afterwards too. But as we know, cyberpunk cinema came into the prominence in the 1980s in the United States as a critique of Reaganomics film, and these films couldn't be actually more relevant today if you think about it. And I don't just mean the political future we are facing, but also the proliferation of AI in our daily lives and the advanced stages in our climate crisis. And these films show us different versions, different stories on how humans engage with machines in built and natural environments. The exhibition explores the genre through an international and multi-generational lens, featuring more than 25 films, including classic cyberpunk cinema, films such as Blade Runner, The Terminator, Ghost in the Shell, Existence, or The Matrix. But I'm particularly excited that we also present these movies alongside more recent futurist films from around the world, including Latinx futurist film like Sleep Dealer, or African futurist films like Pumzi from Kenya or Neptune Frost from Rwanda, and indigenous futurist films such as Night Raiders from Canada. We all benefit. Allowing ancestral knowledge helps shape our futures. And to imagine one's future is a human need for every community. And that was kind of the core for our exhibition on a deep content soul level, if you will. The exhibition is located in the museum's double-height Herd Gallery. It's not very large gallery, it's only 2,000 square feet, but it has 2 floors that we are working with. And so that poses special challenges or opportunities. And I would like to show you a very quick digital fly-through through the exhibition so you get a sense of the space. And then walk you through the show. The exhibition was designed by Laura Belevica and Kalani Ma, who are on staff at the Academy Museum.
Everyone comes from somewhere. I come from noir, from science fiction, from punk and pulp and a bad string of code. My ancestors dreamed of distant galaxies and of aliens close to home.
My mother and father were binary stars.
Dreamed of scientists, time travelers, and creatures who haunt the night. The alien terrain I explore is called Planet Earth Tomorrow. In the stories I tell, the monsters are markets and circuits. My heroes are outsiders who bend and break and survive the system.
So this tool, we haven't really worked with a video fly-through tool so much as we have for this exhibition, but we did so because, as you can see, it involves multiple layers of moving images, and it was really important for us to test and understand how they work together. So as you enter the exhibition, you encounter a poster wall of cyberpunk and futurist films plastered like onto the street. We wanted to employ that language rather than framing posters as we do in other exhibitions here. And then you get an introduction and you look into some literary sources, very few examples that we had chosen here, but you get a sense of how cyberpunk is related to cinema or often even refers or is developed out of literature. And then what you see here, this aspect of the futuristic design, or kind of, not futuristic design, was developed by Laura Belevica, as she called it the thing that creeped through the entire show on both levels. So it was like this metallic piece that comes and makes you enter into this portal, as we call it, where you encounter the vid phone from Blade Runner, which is an original prop from the film. that we have in our collection, but it kind of sucks you into that immersive double height space that includes a projection mapped experience on its 3 walls, and then a single channel montage that we created for this exhibition. And so you'll see how the mood and atmosphere is changing once the environments are changing throughout. We included digital landscapes as well as natural environments and built environments. The core of the exhibition is really that montage that you see, where you see Lawrence Fishburne in the middle. So this is what drives and is kind of the nucleus of the entire exhibition. We hired Alex Rivera, who is a writer and director. He made the film Sleep Dealer, to write a script for us. So that was a very unusual way for us to work or for me also to work as a curator from a different vantage point. I shared the films we worked with and wanted to feature in the exhibition with Alex, and asked him to write a script that tackles the different themes and motifs of cyberpunk and futurist films. And asked him to write a script from the first person's perspective. And so that is kind of the core of the show that you hear on both floors, on the second and on the third level of the exhibition. This is a huge effort to create a piece like this. And so I really also want to thank Alex Rivera first, but then also our editor, Josh Porro, our producer, BJ Thomas, the voiceover artist, Tristan Tuckfield. All of these artists come together to make this piece. So we kind of worked a little bit like a director or an architect, for that matter, where you collaborate with a lot of different artists and specialists. So what I find really exciting when you see this exhibition and are immersed in that show is 15-minute long montage that you encounter in the middle, and the wraparound projection map is 3 minutes long. So you always get a different combination of images that unfold in front of you. You'll see 2 different versions here. And then you go in onto the second floor of the exhibition, where you see a few original objects, props, and drawings from films such as Strange Days, Sleep Dealer, Existence, Videodrome, Night Raiders, The Terminator, as well as Ex Machina, and then Blade Runner. I'm really excited, and they all have their own stories of how they relate to film. We wanted to give you some insights into the various ways of how some of these films are made. Of course, we could have told 50,000 more of these stories with lots more objects to show, but we had to figure out a productive way and wanted to figure out an immersive way of embedding everything together into this one thing, in this one cyberpunk experience, if you will. And this drawing was really important to us. This is a drawing by Sid Mead. Sid Mead was a visual futurist. He used to be an industrial designer first, who designed cars and motorcycles. He worked with Ridley Scott on Blade Runner and was first asked to create the vehicles for the film. But then he started to paint the surrounding of the vehicles as well. And Ridley Scott was so excited and inspired by Sid Mead that he asked him to become the production designer. So the look and feel of the film Blade Runner, and subsequently so many other cyberpunk films, is predominantly shaped by visual futurists like Sid Mead, who, by the way, employed kanji letters, fake kanji letters. They have no meaning, these signages here, but they create like a fake Asian, possibly Japanese environment. So that is a problem maybe in itself, but an interesting one that has resonance throughout cyberpunk cinema and culture. And then, since we are a museum that is collecting as well, I wanted to highlight this object too, which is a costume from Tron. And what is so weird when you see that in person, because in the film it's lit up in blue and it's all done in post-production. Tron 1982 was one of the first films who employs CGI to a great extent throughout the entire film. But then you see this costume and it's so hands-on, old-fashioned, designed by Eloise Jensen and Rosanna Norton. And actually, before they started to design it, the French illustrator Möbius started to illustrate some ideas for these costumes. And they're made of such whimsical materials, such as a sock suit, hockey pads, tape, and markers. And then they appear in the film with blue light as blue circuity. But that's all done, as I said, in post-production. And when you see the object in person, it presents itself as almost something different, but also really handmade, which I find quite interesting. And then we also were able to publish a book, which is really exciting. And that allowed us to dive a little bit deeper into some production histories of the 20+ films that we have chosen to include in this exhibition, along an interview about futurist cinema with Wanuri Kahio from Kenya and Danis Goulet from Canada. Last but not least, I would like to end with this quote from Alex Rivera that he wrote, that is part of the montage, because I found it so fitting. If you've ever wondered why this world gets more divided the more we get connected, if you've ever wanted to press delete on borders and barriers so people are free as data, if you've ever told a story about machines that serve people rather than profit, if you've ever hacked the culture, then you are me. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, Namik, for the invitation, and thank you to my amazing co-panelists. I'm Samatha Culp. I'm going to time this and try to keep on a timetable here. Stopwatch, there we go. Hi, I'm Samatha Culp. I'm a writer, filmmaker, and researcher, and my current project is a nonfiction book I'm writing that focuses on how futures thinking has evolved as a cultural concept and a commercial industry over the past century. I also want to note my gratitude to the Alfred J. Sloan Foundation, which has supported this project. I've, for a long time, been particularly interested in how the future has a history, and that is a global history, and it is both kind of everywhere and nowhere. I mean, the future, everything that we do, the capital F future is a part of all of our lives, and history and politics, technology, et cetera. But I became very interested at a certain point in people and groups and practitioners who think about the future for a living, literally, and what is this role known as futurist, which itself is kind of can be a complex term. Who wants to embrace that term? Or in a way, some of the most interesting people who work in and around this field refuse to use that term to describe themselves, and I think is quite telling and interesting. So I'm particularly interested in these things and how futures thinking has really been shaped by a tension between radical, humanitarian, ecological, and utopian visions on one hand, and the forces of capitalism, colonialism, and militarism on the other. So to interject myself into this conversation, and with some extreme experts in exhibition making, design, architecture, urbanism, I was going to, per Namik's invitation, just to give a really brief intro of kind of like, what is this thing called like futures, and also what words are we using and why, that is based on my research. And also, if you had 10 people from this field probably in this room, they would debate about what the definitions are of how these practices break down, but I'm gonna give my kind of a brief overview. Okay, so, this was taken, the United Nations last month during the General Assembly week had something called the Summit of the Future, which was a particular event showing kind of a lot of these traditions and varying frameworks and thinking about the future and working on the future converging in one place and one time, and ratified something called the Declaration on Future Generations, which maybe I will get a chance to talk about if there's enough time. But but I wanted to start actually first with this image, because I was thinking about the topic of staging futures, our title for this event, and the wonderful exhibitions branching off of Liam's Planet City project and of staging the history of cyberpunk at the Academy Museum, and the whole tradition of art and design, envisioning the future, newer strands of speculative design, experiential futures, et cetera. And when it comes to staging futures, we have these kind of creative, experimental, visual, spatial, sensory ways of speculating about the futures. But the stage, where so much of the future and futures thinking and decision making about things that impact all of our futures, a lot of them happened here. Like, this is the stage, this is the exhibition, this is the hall, like the gallery, where these processes take place. Quite literally, this is of a Royal Dutch Shell in the 1970s, when they were working on scenarios to navigate the oil crisis and the energy crisis in the 70s, which was a time, anyway, I'll get to that in a second. So here's, this is a version of where some futuring takes place. And then I also think that I think it's really important that in the moment of there's kind of a new proliferation of approaches to speculative design, future-facing art, exhibition making, that we think about how these two types of stages interact, or just as often kind of fail to interact in the ways that we might wish, especially when it comes to actual decision making and policy and kind of pressing on the levers of power. So, futures, enormous topic. Essentially, some terminology I think is important. I'm using the term futures thinking because I think it's the broadest possible, maybe umbrella, under which there's lots of other terms, practices, methodologies. A few of them include futures, future studies, futures research, futurology, foresight, strategic foresight, scenario planning. That's really just a methodology. Some people use that to stand in for the whole of futures. Futurism, which I think people could use it in an expansive way, but if you're trying to really get granular about things, futurism is more specifically about any type of a specific vision with specific stakes, sometimes with specific aesthetics, such as in the origination of the term, the Italian futurists in the early part of the 20th century, who had a very specific vision, ideology, et cetera. And we talk about Silicon Valley futurism as something that already kind of comes prepackaged. It kind of has a shape to it. It's not so much the description of a process. So I was going to just give kind of a very kind of broad working definition that is in progress of trying to think about what is the broadest umbrella under which a lot of different things fall. These kind of ranging from think tanks, policymaking, climate modeling, activism that relates to envisioning new futures for a community or a part of the city, and then of course in the field of urbanism, architecture, design, and all of those traditions kind of can fit under here. I would say, while it emerged in its modern kind of formalized form through military and corporate planning, futures thinking encompasses all of these different approaches, and I think has always been animated by this sort of spectrum of ways, also theories of change, like how different ideas can meet the road of actual action and policy creation and design. Hang on. As Namik beautifully introduced, this is one of the oldest traits of human society and culture. There's a joke that futurists are the second oldest profession. When you think about fortune tellers, I mean, it's quite literally probably true. In ancient times, the authority to speak about the future was rooted in this more divine or mystical power. The oracle at Delphi, the predictions were not just, but I think what's interesting is important to look at historians working on this at the moment, emphasize that it's not just a spiritual practice. This is not just a spiritual history, that the oracle at Delphi literally was, they were political instruments, legitimizing state decisions, maintaining order. And they also were kind of a form of early intelligence. Scholars have compared them to like the ancient Greek CIA, because there was a lot of intelligence coming in and being kind of metabolized and then funneled back out through this as a channel, with and without the knowledge of the kind of clients who were coming to consult them. So I think it's an interesting model, has a very, very ancient way of looking at futures knowledge being institutionalized and deployed with certain agendas and power structures. And in a way, I'm going to make kind of a big jump here, that there's a lot of other history of kind of I think the pre-World War II history of futures is also long and complex, and sadly don't have the time to go into it at the moment. But I think many scholars of this work cite, the beginning of the deployment of the atomic bomb at the end of World War II, destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, being this turning point in humanity's relationship with the future and ideas about the future, and as something that could, decisions being made could end human, civilization as we know it with the push of a button. And so therefore there was an even bigger push. I think for many, over a century, there had been ideas of, with the rise of history and historiography as an established scholarly tradition, and with like the archaeology and evolution, people such as H.G. Wells proposing, why aren't there historians of the future? We need professors of foresight. But it had not really reached a point of being formalized until the urgency and the kind of necessity of the early Cold War environment. And so places like, this is across town at Rand Corporation in Santa Monica, where this is really the birth of what is considered a trajectory of kind of like contemporary futures thinking and foresight processes. So this emerged also not, the day after D-Day, but it was kind of, the groundwork was really laid for this by what's called operations research. So it was during wartime, and the kind of planning the war effort, designing, manufacturing, testing of weapons, was as well as then like optimizing battlefield tactics and war strategy. Operations research was more from the UK, emerging as a scientific methodology for this type of strategic thinking, game theory, and this kind of militarization of futures thinking, where prediction becomes like a weapon in itself. At Rand, famously, by thinking about the cinema and the structures of cinema and how important these are, even as metaphors, and the way that our imaginations work, and then how persuasion works, is Herman Kahn, very famously, who is a kind of a template for Dr. Strangelove. He created the term scenario. He borrowed the term scenario for scenario planning from his neighbors who were working in Hollywood, writing scenarios, scripts. And so there's this kind of like bleed over immediately about like how to not just do analysis of futures, and in this case was about how to prevent nuclear apocalypse by kind of, game theory about how to mind game, the Soviet Union, but how there was an early awareness among all the people who were forming this discipline that the communication of these ideas and persuasion and creating a space for people then to occupy these possible futures was extremely important, and relied on borrowing from all kinds of disciplines, from cinema and obviously like theater, psychology, in terms of their wargaming. And then of course we have a very long tradition of the role, architecture, urban design have always been the stage for a lot of envisioning and then mobilizing kind of consensus around visions of the future. This is from the Osaka Expo 1970, that I just love this kind of this bubble world that is designed, this sort of hyperbole as a tool as well to, and the estrangement factor to bring people into this potential future vision. And so I think I'm running late already. There is, at the time where a lot of these techniques are being developed within the military-industrial complex, not only at RAND, but also at SRI at Stanford, there's an interesting turn, though, that happens as the Cold War progresses, that partially due to, I think, just the corporate world tuning into these tactics and thinking this could be useful. And that also dovetails with the actually some declining defense budgets at a certain point. The Department of Defense gives less and less money to RAND. Some RAND people decide to branch out, start their own think tank someplace, like Herman Kahn went to start Hudson Institute. Some of the principals from RAND also went up to the Bay Area to start the Institute for the Future, which still exists, and to work on private sector problems, because that's where the money is. And then you have much bleed over kind of starting to happen into the corporate world. This is a famous book, Future Shock by Alvin Toffler, published in 1970, which kind of also just popularized this. It was massive, massive, massive bestseller. It had a documentary that and there was like a Curtis Mayfield song. Like, it was a real pop cultural touch point of not just the idea of like future, but are there specific tools, methodologies, frameworks for thinking about change and how this could be used in a variety of contexts, from the sphere of kind of like social and political debate to being hired directly by corporations to do work inside. I'm gonna skip over this for a second. So Pierre Vac is considered the sort of godfather of scenario planning, who was at the Royal Dutch Shell in the early 70s, and who was somebody who also kind of introduced this idea of trying to make these varying models of the future real as a way to force his own company to contend with the unthinkable. And kind of retroactively, this became part of a great myth of Shell, as the fact that they had this scenario planning department is how they weathered the oil crisis better than a lot of the other fossil fuel companies. Of course, the kind of irony, which I think comes up more and more, is that a lot of these tools for thinking critically, robustly about the future and acting on it were so often, more than not, employed within the fossil fuel industry, the energy sector, in ways that have actively endangered our future with the climate crisis that we are in. And that, there's often right now, there's some really interesting lawsuits happening around some of these scenario packets from decades past that showed very plainly that the oil companies knew exactly what the risks of global heating were. Okay, so just to briefly kind of bring us, so over the decades, these needs and desires to manage change and uncertainty often being used within large corporations and for the purpose of capitalist growth and accumulation. There's also these parallel traditions, not just of kind of like design or sci-fi and cinema, but that we're specifically trying to work on kind of civic, social problems, and kind of from a more like social democratic European tradition. That's kind of a bit more like futurology as a more slightly academic and then kind of just civic-minded tradition in Europe, which was different from the RAND strand of things. I think over the decades became more and more interested in how to make these ideas real, how to pull the future close, how to pull participants and stakeholders into these potential future scenarios. And so tools such as like theater, obviously image making, filmmaking, and role play games, and a variety of different kinds of immersive experiences. There's a kind of a turn, sort of like the experiential futures turn that starts to happen kind of more as coming from academic futures world in the early 2000s, and then kind of dovetailing with the rise of like speculative design and design fiction, design futures coming out of like the RCA in London and the work of Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby. And I think this brings us up a little bit just to the present of how to make future questions and future debates really real and immersive. So I think there's been such a variety of tactics over time. This current moment sees, I think, things that were often kind of more in the artistic or design or activist or philosophical realm entering into the mainstream of futures work. And now that there's also, not only a project such as Planet City and the exhibitions happening here, but the, design fiction workshops happening inside of Google and other, enormous corporations working on, here, I'll come right to the end here. Maybe working with different agendas using some of the same tools. And I think there's always been a really interesting and complicated realm of, navigating, especially for futures designers and workers who were looking to make positive change with their work and to not so easily be co-opted back into the same systems that they were kind of an alternative to. Anyways, I think that the ideal that runs through a lot of this work of speculating on the future and making it visible, sensory, real, tactile is just show alternatives. And I think that that's kind of one of the most powerful things that should be retained and hopefully can actively create more spaces actually to contest power as we move forward. Okay, thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Namik, for inviting us and for those beautiful provocations. I'm Nora. I'm a writer. To take up some of the amazing questions that we've been asked to think through, I actually went back to my favorite place in the world, which is the Museum of Jurassic Technology. And I'm sure a few of you have been here. There is this hallway. I'm pretty sure you can't take pictures, so I don't know how these folks posted this to YouTube, but there is this hallway of literal miniature theaters that show how thunder, water, and wind were simulated, and I think the title is Miracles and Disasters and Renaissance and Baroque Theater Mechanics. And for me, weirdly, this Baroque theater staging has helped me think over the last 10 years about another drama very close to my heart, which is that of showcasing artists who work critically with technology. You need clever machines for staging, you need ways to show competing myths and fantasies. Sometimes the wool over the eyes should be pulled away, and sometimes the visions of the utopia to come are just cardboard. And then there's all that beautiful work that happens beneath the stage and around it that help create belief. So in a way, I try to engage with technology and philosophy of technology as a story of carefully orchestrated illusions atop really intense material infrastructure, a kind of theater that shifts perspective, that plays with the audience, a proscenium creating multiple dimensions where there are none, that masks and obfuscates, that lights and dims. And specifically, it's these changes in scene, the transformation from one model over to the next that stays with me, whether I'm looking at a game world or a million image data set. Seeing the mechanics of the theater allows for imaginative leaps and a pitch towards the future, a kind of exercise in changing the set and changing the model. So I came to curation accidentally through writing about games, about software, about simulation. I guess I first trained in deconstructing systems. So I want to share in my timed 15 minutes a few ways in which coming from this other place outside of art and outside of curation, starting first with algorithmic capture and machines looking at us, has shaped my understanding of how exhibitions stage futures. A lot of my time is spent here trying to articulate the hidden and unseen aspects of the design of machine learning, the design of AI, trying to capture what we might feel but never see, what we might intellectually know but find impossible to track, to look at what is beyond our scale and comprehension. It's also spent thinking with simulations and in them, where the theater of simulation offers the beauty of revision. Simulations have this incredibly high tolerance for ridiculous complexity, distilling values into strategy and into material. Simulations make ideology real and also endlessly revisable. To simulate is, as Alan Bertos argues in this incredible book, The Vicarious Brain, to simulate is to pitch yourself and your mind into the future, to think of a future avatar of yourself after this symposium, walking through a virtual world. So we have evolved to simulate the future to mentally survive today to get to the next. So early on, this was more chatter than model building. I would say from when I started making shows and exhibitions in 2011 to 2016, there was an overflow of lightly documented salons, endless panels and symposia. And the questions feel kind of sweet and maybe naive now, a lot of hand-wringing about what was AI and how would we live with it, how was it trained and after what models. a few gestures at what would become and what we live in right now. The shows were intimate. They were in living rooms, installations of software works in bedrooms, tons of debate and discussion, and the creation of a kind of public. Artists really drove these conversations with their inquiries on predictive policing and algorithmic harm, and a ton of amazing strategic and activist work emerged. Perhaps most critical were these attempts to answer what kind of alternative paradigms for technology could we build. A lot of these shows and exhibitions were online and tied to questions that we hoped would remain relevant. How will we invent models of experimentation as artists, designers, working with technology? How could those models be sustainable? Would we work on the blockchain? How would we reflect on value, distribution, and circulation? How do we theorize the computational image or the living generative soft image, as Ingrid Hosel theorizes? So for me, what really became exciting were exhibitions and showmaking that tried to create, like Views of Planet City does so well, new images of the future. A Wild Ass Beyond, ApocalypseRN, was one such collective experiment in 2018, suggesting how we will live in the wake of today's technology after the techno-utopian visions of an engineered, innovated, improved social order have collapsed. This was created with American artists, Caitlin Cherry and Sondra Perry, and our hope together as a collective was to proffer another type of wild beyond after Fred Moten, in which survivors, having lived through generations of algorithmic prediction, live and work. Our research took us to prepper gatherings in central Michigan, to the largest tiny house festival in the US in Texas. We spoke and filmed veterans and women, countless people who decided to refashion their life, to either prepare for precarity or an unknown future full of imagined threats ranging from immigrants to race war to the government taking our water. We started to build the exhibition around questions tilted towards the future that felt pretty unanswerable. What kind of art and music would we make in this future? What kind of music? What transferable skills did we even have as writers, filmmakers, painters, sculptors that would transfer to this future wild? Perhaps myth-making, archiving, foraging, composting mushrooms, generating models where there were none, much as we do now, inventing ways to get through and inside unforgiving systems. Other questions that have stayed with me from this project, namely, how will we live with the memory of predictive models, the memory of our digital twin, our minds blown by taking in more information in an hour these days than a 19th century person took in a lifetime. To live in the wild after a decade or two of your social risk score being tracked, all these systems shaping our lives materially and psychologically. A next project, Manual Override, allowed for staging experimental works about AI in a theater. And I was brought back to my early secret theater days and days in set design, choreographing the exhibition as a kind of psychological game or thriller. In curating, I tried to put myself into the mind of a viewer, much as when writing, who knows maybe very little about the material ahead, is possibly even aggressively disinterested, to try and coax them in so they hopefully leave with some sense of agency over this complex relationship with technology, emerging in other ways. The artists were Sondra Perry, Morehshin Allahyari, Lynn Hershman Leeson, Simon Fujiwara, and Martine Syms. And these are artists who many of you might already know, who have looked throughout their 10, 15, 40-year practices at system overrides, at overturns of systems, whether algorithmic, machinic, digital, and other systems, cultural, and have been critically engaged with technology for decades on collectively. And I found that the collective, any artists who are critically engaged with technology are invariably obsessed with power and control and management, which is a drama that unfolds in ever more nefarious and insane ways. So having a theater to stage these works instead of a white-walled gallery felt ideal for artists who think about the drama that AI produces around creativity, ownership, authenticity, surveillance, prediction, and risk. So I'll pause very quickly, focusing in on two works by Sondra Perry and Simon Fujiwara. Sondra's work Heavy Metal and Reflective is the short title for it, really wanted the museum, the shed, to be part of the work. And we're actually conceiving of the exhibition as the museum was still being built, and the museum was finally opened a couple of months before this show opened. So she actually began filming the museum, filming the iron welding on the roof of the shed. She worked from there into the surrounding of Hudson Yards, the funding of the architecture of this bombastic building. If anyone's seen it in New York, you know what I'm talking about. On into the long history of iron used at that site, the iron ties and railroads around Hudson Yards, iron used in shackles, melted down for use in industrial yards, out to iron meteorites. So the final work is a film, a cauldron, a set of shackles, an iron tie in this aggressive-looking pointed sculpture here. In Simon Fujiwara's Empathy 1, choreography would step in again, where visitors would take a ticket and wait for their turn on a roller coaster ride. Simon collaborated with a theme park ride company in Italy to develop this simulator experience. Riders are rocked to found footage of first-person videos on YouTube, and a dizzying, nauseating ride for many of 4 minutes, complete with a little splash of water. You rock with the movements, and you move between about 150 videos mashed into this 4.5 minutes, birthdays and funerals and bungee jumps, and really feel tied into the images. You're kind of bouncing and synchronized with the movements that you're watching. And you feel ostensibly pleasure, sadness, danger, and fear right up in front, but you're also made to feel the limit of your body and mind and switching context so rapidly, something we all might feel familiar with from day to day. The last piece I'll show is a cosmic movie camera, which is the most recent version of the Biennale de l'Image Mouvement in Genève, a biennial that since the 80s has been focused on the moving image and is taken up by a new curator every couple of years, their interpretation. My first question in approaching this biennial this last couple of years ago is, what can the artistic moving image even offer in an oversaturated moment of so many moving and generated images? What kind of strategies of discernment and evaluation can artists offer? This biennial is unusual in that there's no stated frame, so instead we gave a prompt to the artists, which was the recent discovery of a photon ring outside of black holes called the Ring of All Possible Images, a cosmic movie camera. Important because it's only seen through simulation, through mediation, from which a theory and multiple theories are then made. So a theory based on a simulation, based on an unseen ring of light. Other questions that are threaded ghostly through the exhibition are, how do we keep the ghosts of the algorithmic in mind? False images, false memories of images shown to be false, and a deepening sense of systems that track, sort, and see, and how will, of course, we live with them in the future. The gathered artists were asked to create films and installations which took up this concept of the unseen and maybe the incomputable, with works from 15 artists on genetic testing, a film on an image of a castle turned into a juvenile prison in Switzerland, Lawrence Leck with another epic entry in his saga of autonomous vehicles, this one put on trial, asked to defend itself in the 2050s or maybe sooner. It's impossible to go through all of the works, but you can watch them thanks to Peter Wu, who's in the second row here in the black hat, is the founder of Epoch Gallery, who made this stunning world, which is the virtual exhibition Paired, which people can experience every film, almost every film, in the biennial forever and ever. And I was super inspired, deeply inspired by Peter's curatorial ethos, in which he works with each artist to discern what in fact can be done in the simulation and the virtual that the in-person couldn't touch. So this ranges from artists imagining spaces as they desired in the real space that we could not accommodate, offering archival maps, process representations, elements that live or become more alive in the virtual. So in this way, the virtual stage and the physical stage speak to one another, maybe, just maybe, allowing all these heady themes around algorithmic systems and their competition, accelerated production and consumption of images, haunting, grief, and everything that we've lost in all the promises of new technological futures to speak to one another. The hope was maybe that the virtual stage translates our private experiences of the works into an ongoing and collective consideration. Future contexts will change the work. I'll move forward a bit. Make them dated. Maybe these works will look naive or inadequate, to be sure, but the feeling of this particular moment, the struggle that we make to make sense of the real and increasingly simulated world in socio-technical algorithmic capture might say something in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, what we were able to do at this moment and about the things that we lost. This museum, the Centre d'Art, is also being torn down in real life, I think beginning next spring, but it stays here as a future home of the works, sitting in a degraded Geneva with climate change even touching Switzerland. And the works continue to play in a building that will be unrecognizable soon. This virtual space, each time I return to it, is informed by speculation on how it will feel to watch our current critique and struggles through art making in a degraded future. Imagining a future audience, an audience you can't imagine the exact circumstances of, heightens for me, and hopefully for others, the urgency of current work. Imagining a future audience living out our current decisions, our current policies and designs, and watching the work of today creates an atmosphere for entry into the imperatives of the work. Time stretches and collapses in the virtual future context, grounding the works not as speculation, but as artistic research, archives, emblems of this moment, emblems of what we were able to discern and what we are currently blind to. And so these works with the virtual fires burning outside mark a future audience that we, mark for a future audience, that we knew what was coming, but yet couldn't yet see a way out, helping them in their own revisions of strategy. So I often, to close, turn to Octavia Butler in crisis moments. And these past few weeks, I've been seeing a specific quote of hers from an interview that's been circulating, in which she notes, "All I did as a writer was look at the problem we're neglecting now and give them about 30 years to grow into full-fledged disasters. There's no single answer that will solve all our future problems. There's no magic bullet. Instead, there are thousands of answers." So of the thousands of answers, I still feel strongly optimistic that exhibitions and art as a speculative apparatus focus eyes and minds on what is neglected now, as they can model the unseen in the current moment. They can center both present disaster and future disaster, offering a few models of 1,000 possible ones. So I look forward to speaking with all of you about these, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Nora. Thank you all. I think we will go just straight to the panel in the interest of time and everyone's attention span, etc., and stress levels. So will you please join me on stage? Nora, Doris, Adam, and Samatha. And we'll just dig into it. Thank you all for mind-stretching excursions. Since we have heard such different positions or perspectives, allow me just briefly recapitulate how I would sort of sum up the sort of gist of what you were talking about. We had Adam talk us through the mechanics of exhibition making as a way to access distilled, let's say, intersections with both concrete industrial contexts of worlds in which futures are made or communicated or imagined or disseminated, but also a way of finding interesting kind of subversion points or points of refracting what's on display and allowing for perhaps multiple modes of entry into the works that are on show. And I think that was a way of kind of cracking open right at the start what an exhibition really ideally does with the works. Then we had Doris present a work which was quite interesting in the way that it kind of takes care of an industrial memory of a certain row of let's say, intellectual, cultural products and gives them a body, literally, where they speak in a kind of unified voice. Then we went on with Samantha's kind of very brief but dense contextualization of futures in a hegemonic capitalist order where the future really is staged, or rather prepared or cooked in boardrooms and behind the different kinds of scenes than the ones that we have access to. And the question then becomes, of course, where do they intersect, or what is the agency left over to us mere mortals? Finally, Nora took it back again into the, I feel that you both represented the curatorial, but also the artistic perspective in the whole thing, and took us behind the scenes of a more critical and perhaps more conscientious engagement with the meeting between the emergent technologies and futures as a kind of archaic or timeless practice. So together, I think this is quite an interesting canvas to begin with. I would like maybe to pose a question to all of you to begin with, which has to do with imagining the, let's say, the widest possible engagement with futures. Where are the possibilities? Where are the hurdles to that? What are even the points of that? What are the real, what are the prospects of a more democratized, let's say, engagement with futures, given that so much of that is already filtered through either very specialist or artistic or indeed very resource-intensive operations? Whoever would like to begin.
So what are the prospects for a more democratized engagement with shaping the future and the kind of
thinking about it?
Thinking about it. Yeah. I mean, I think that there are lots of, there is a range, a full toolkit of traditions ranging from, artistic, design-based, speculative to, like I didn't get to speak about, but the kind of futures workshops that were initiated by Robert Jung in the 1960s in Germany from a very social democratic and anti-war perspective, and were meant to do just, to what we were speaking about, citizen assemblies, essentially to do, bringing in a wide range of diverse publics of multiple ages, generations, backgrounds to confront a future problem, to model it, to workshop it out, and then come up with some kind of new, insights that could be mobilized for action. So some of these traditions exist, and I think with varying, depends on the context in which they're occurring. I think perhaps some, cities in Austria in the 1960s might have been, there was more metabolization of these processes and outputs into kind of some formal, structures of change. I think we can still pull from these traditions. It's just going to take, I think, perhaps more and more, the most interesting futures work becomes activist work, or is drawing from and heavily inspired by and leans on that kind of work. So I think that wherever there are possibilities of those two things crossing, and again, in the past several years, a lot more of kind of visioning as an activist tradition, and then meeting some of these more people coming from foresight or design futures. Those intersections, I think, are really promising and exciting and inspiring, and just need perhaps the same resources that some of the more, that a corporate foresight engagement receives.
I just found it interesting. I mean, to what you were saying, one of the works, particularly in the Views of Planet City, John Cooper's project, which involves a whole team of comrades, models kind of a direct bridging through practice, which is, practice might be called speculative, or it might be called prototypical, but it somehow models this sort of exit from a hypothetical speculation and into a kind of mode of working and acting that may or may not lead us somewhere, but at least it tries something. I think there's something there in sort of breaching the fourth wall in that sense of actually modeling action or even
Yeah, absolutely.
performing it, right? Another thing that I saw as a kind of crossing across the presentations that you were doing, beginning with Adam, is the way that these projects, and the three of you, Adam and Doris and Nora, there's an element of, there's an ambition to sort of embody or to create a visual and physical form for a certain invisible entity, or a kind of sum it all up in an envelope of some kind. I think in Adam's case, you're trying to represent quite big systems of production in a very minimalist and sort of not anecdotal, but epigrammatic ways, with these quoting materials and structural sort of arrangements of film industry. Doris, your exhibition design is this body, really, that seems to point at something that is maybe mentioned directly, and also the first-person voice speaking on behalf of cyberpunk as a genre, as a kind of collective memory of something. What is behind that? Is that something that we can explore somehow further, this embodiment of an otherwise not presented entity or agent, let's say?
I mean, about the embodiment, and we ask ourselves very often the question, like, why are we talking about this now? Who are we to talk about it? What is our perspective towards it, towards our futures? And there's just not one answer. There's never one answer. And that's the exciting part about it, but also the challenging one when you have to make something physical in a space. And something that tells a story, something in our case at the museum historicizes it to a certain extent while trying to give it shape. All that combined, I think, was part of it, and our effort, I think, to look less into all the production histories, but more into shaping something, with the material that we have at our fingertips to work with and think about, felt like the more exciting thing to do. With the full acknowledgement that this is one setting, one scenario out of many possible scenarios there could be.
I think what really keeps me up is the trap of didactic explanation, especially in working with technology or software or AI, and cultural institutions and artists are often put into this position of having to explain the thing. And so every time you have an AI exhibition or an art and text exhibition, so much time and effort from the labels to the curatorial text to the tours falls into this pedagogical and didactic kind of role. And as a teacher, I love explanation and pedagogy. But I think, when, must every exhibition about technology repeat what the thing is, how it works, what we must do about it, but instead can the exhibition respond to the ideas that are collectively, noisily, in full contradiction with one another, how they're speaking one to another. And so I think in working with artists who are working critically with these ideas about the future and what kind of systems are we creating that are producing the future, I think of how can the exhibition be like a slow film, like a system that presents this collective ideas of inquiry and then allows the viewer to pick and choose and cobble their own together. So it's less a didactic space and more a kind of living organism, living being.
I'm going to go back to your first question and also, Samantha, to your presentation, because I spent way too many years of my life working on imagined futures, the 60s and 70s, and I'm going to go to Fuller. I think the world game was the beginning of a possible future and also the end of it. And I say that with some lament, but also with some excitement that with the world game, Fuller has this amazing quote, right? That politicians will yield to computer. And that's exactly how he writes it, right? And it's a kind of technocratic future. It's totally egalitarian, ruled through technologies that didn't exist at the time, right? It was a speculative idea about what future would be, where no one would be hungry. Some really strange ideas that consuming a certain number of calories per day, which could be equitably distributed over the planet, right, would lead to a sense of enlightenment, right? And of course, now we have the technology that Fuller didn't have, in 1967. And yet, here we are. And so it's to say, and I don't mean to be pessimistic, and it has nothing to do with the election, let's say, but that vision of the future was born out of World War II and the Cold War and died in the 70s, which is not to be pessimistic because it's now a different future that we've charted for ourselves.
We might need another war or end of some kind, some kind of end horizon, and embrace it fully in order to sort of really believe in a new future. To bounce off of what, Nora, you were presenting, our conversation actually the other day, it seems to me that one of the ways, and that's tied to my previous question about sort of visualizing the invisible or somehow giving voice or body to something that is otherwise seems incoherent or impossible to relate to as a body or as an entity. There is a very concrete way in which we are all very implicated, not just in the emergence of futures, or at least scenarios that are leading us into futures through our interaction with technology, but we are actually implicated in the kind of evolving anatomy of the future technologies, right? In the way that you're saying, the way that machines are looking back at us, the way that we are training them, or we are training entire systems of technologies to become better at what somebody wants them to perform. And with higher or lower sort of price to pay, depending on where in the world you live, you are subject to technological evolution. You are captive to it, let's say. So in a very real way, we are not just an audience, we are very much workers of the future. We are also somehow implicated in that metabolism or that sort of that evolutionary anatomy. Does that suggest some ways to, again, open up other ways of engaging or pry open other modes of involving different groups, different ages, different professions into, let's say, a widened conversation about the futures? And I sound now kind of willful. I'm kind of playing an idiot here because most people don't really necessarily want to care or want to imagine the future. It's also profoundly anxiety-inducing kind of entity. But let's say that there is perhaps also a recognition that this is something that should be much more of an agenda. That is something that we should be kind of promoting much more aggressively, this kind of engagement, active engagement with entering the future, so to speak.
I mean, I think it ties to your first question about what are the impasses or blocks to getting people into like a future thinking kind of mode. And I think what I could like tie the two together by, as a writer, like language and narrative are a kind of simulation building, like I just touched on briefly. Like early text-based games that had no images whatsoever were meant to produce the next scene. So every sentence would produce the next scene, and that would, would branch into this like long tree. So every time you speak, every sentence that is written produces some sort of world. It's a world building within a sentence, and we're actively debating the outcomes of simulations that drive city planning and urban planning like every day, all the time. Every time that there was a climate disaster, Hurricane Katrina being like a really infamous example of this climate simulations and models that were given out to the public showed no people in them, which directly affected a lot of disaster planning disastrously, and then affected all of the simulation representation in the future. So like maps, land deeds, simulations, that you can run on your phone. Right now, there's like a lot of incredible AI simulation software I won't go into, but from like you speaking and the structure of your language and the syntax of your language to how you engage with technology every day, you are already taking part in future making. You're already part of it. We're all already part of it. So it's not this massive scale. It doesn't have to be this massive scale project that is collectively done through consensus. It's something you're actively doing all of the time. So I think I keep coming back to that cognitive act that we're future making like right now.
We're like the Dutch shell company, but without the paychecks.
Yeah.
And we are not only men, right? Like these pictures.
Yeah. There isn't
so clearly.
It was so, yes, it's so white and so male, but actually, women who were working in those same spaces too. So it's, what I was just going to say briefly is on the topic of what Nora mentioned about, maps and simulations and models, and especially in the moment of increasing climate crisis, not in the even a couple years out, but right now and last week and whatever, that I also think that this is, and to your point about should people be more engaged in these questions and these, I think that there are also structural forces preventing people from that. And specifically, like there was maybe you guys are aware, in Oregon, in the past, 2 years ago, state of Oregon decided to make a lot more of its maps and models about wildfire risk public. And then homeowners flipped out and kind of sued the state, I guess, I don't know if it was counties or state, to remove the maps, to make them not public anymore. So I think all of this is I think the kind of acceleration of the collision, the art and science collide as the PST theme, this collision with the realities of climate change that are happening quicker and quicker, and especially going to interface with things like home insurance in this state and others, it's just accelerating the collision with this sometimes, but without, of course, people who most maybe need information and then to be involved in decision making are the ones least likely to and prevented from that.
Right. And at the same time, there are examples of people almost randomly selected to participate in these kind of panels about collective decision making regarding the future of some local community, which turns out, and I forget now concrete examples or date footnote kind of information comes later, but often turn out to be better prepared to tackle the future than expert panels. There's something about the kind of collective intelligence which then, when harnessed, can really produce interesting results. Building off on that, you were talking very much about these hegemonic sort of structures of futuring, talking about corporations and various think tanks, states, etc., and how that then gels or does not gel with these more, let's say, bottom-up, artistic, designerly engagements, speculations on the future, and how there is actually a different type of metabolizing of intelligence. I forgot who said that, if it was you or one of you. But I find that what our field lacks is a real serious, what is called theory of change, right? Which in organizing and which in these kind of systems, actors is a very seriously taken ideological kind of engine.
Absolutely.
Which we often, artists, designers, refuse as a kind of simplistic or sometimes maybe kind of too prescriptive idea. Do you think there is something there that we possess perhaps the imagination and the kind of transversal thinking, but sometimes we don't have the patience to commit to a model which maybe might need other kinds of frameworks of commitment around it?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot. I mean, I think theories of change is such an important topic, and I think I was also going to say that certainly the future's field, like it is a set of fields, it is a nested, interlinking, things that are both. I think there's lots of disconnects even within what we could call like even a greater community of like speculative designers. Like there's disconnects, there's geographical differences, regional differences, the way some of these things play out here in the States versus in other countries and in the global South. And that's also to say there is certainly the presence of and some very astute analyses and projects around theories of change within the futurist world. And there's a thing called the Three Horizons by a guy named Bill Sharp, which is different from the McKinsey Three Horizons. There's kind of change. The point is, I do think that is such a critical piece of all of this puzzle. It is often, I think, skipped or because there's the time, of course, the time and the resources necessary to like figure out what comes next after. But I do think that that is something I find challenging, is sometimes thinking about a lot of the work of imaginative futures, speculative fiction, speculative cinema, design, etc., which is super important, and even visioning workshops for a community, incredibly important. But then if it's about raising awareness, what then? And this is a problem with a lot of the kind of climate fiction narratives as well, is where does the kind of power analysis of like what structure this is going into, and then what then? And I do think that that's something that it's not like there's an absence of it completely. Like there are resources to draw on to connect some of these threads, but I think there's disconnect.
Right.
Yeah.
It seems to me that if we posited it's our, let's say, ambition to instill a different imaginary of the future. Liam's ambition behind Planet City, if I may quote him, was to kind of launch a new planetary imaginary, to sort of leap over the dystopian horizon that is sort of defining us or blocking us, and suggest the day after as something different and something rosy, literally, and something that can actually hold hope, and is provocative precisely, maybe above all for that reason, because it dares to suggest hope, right? But then if that is the goal, then what are the criteria of success, and how do we get there? And I think that's a kind of a piece of work that we all have to do. And I think a lot of that, if I'm understanding you correctly, lies in the secret to kind of operationalizing that is in connecting to other actors, or maybe organizing ourselves within larger...
having other sources of power and coalition building, like to actually do something with more of the visions that are really important. And again, it's not to say that the art and design needs to be instrumentalized constantly,
no,
but so I think when it has the thematics of addressing emergency that we believe to be so urgent, which it is, then having some of these other connective tissue to these other types of power and other entities and communities that are very good at the theories of change part. Yeah.
That's why I think science fiction, be it in writing or in filmmaking or other creative practices, is kind of a freedom of expression to a certain extent that you can't have in the same manner if you express your current surroundings as we might see them. The moment of allowing yourself to envision something else, to be speculative about your futures, allows you to talk about things you might not be able to talk about otherwise. And I found it always so fascinating when we talked to Bandler, who is a Kenyan filmmaker. She said, I don't want to be tied down to making problem films about Kenya or Africa, West Africa, for example, but she wants to talk about things that are dear to her heart, but with a different vantage point. And that vantage point is important for her creativity in storytelling. And I find this really fascinating as a, it does not necessarily solve our problems. I mean, it does not. But it at least allows us to create, to imagine, to envision. And that act alone brings people together and let us talk about things. And, I find empowerment in fiction, in envisioning the futures in a speculative manner. Right?
Absolutely. But I was just going to just briefly add that I think that maybe this is also part of an interesting issue where sometimes in this moment, like all the work of artists that at all deals with questions of the future is now then going to be put into a bucket of its futures, it's speculative, it is connected maybe to these other industries of future making, the image making about the future, et cetera. And obviously, I completely agree, like artists should be free, there is a role for that is absolutely critical. And in the kind of longer, bigger picture, more diffuse process of creating new imaginaries, I think is super important, and just the work of the heart and the soul. But I also think then when there is a lot of attention being paid to, well, this is going to be great because it will raise awareness about, the climate emergency, and maybe it shouldn't be tried to mobilize for that reason. And then also, if it is, then how to put it in a context where it's not on the artist to fix the problem, but how to take some of those visions expand them, which again, people are doing, but how to embed it in a theory of change that's more about, that's not only about raising awareness.
I just wanted to add a quick note. I mean, saying that artists, designers are change makers sounds like grant language, but it really is. At least from my corner, changing one's theory and changing one's model of the world is incredibly hard to do, especially as systems themselves evolve at rates and speeds and in ways that we can barely track or keep up with. Many of the artists that I work with who practice analysis of systems and the way that systems are designed to obfuscate their ideology and design and intention is a kind of first step to a theory of change, and also keeping up that analysis of these evolving systems too. So to be able to be trained in seeing through models to the ideologies beneath is almost a first step in the ways that design, aesthetics, and power come together to create stories of a future that we then live out. So for me to even get to a theory of change, that reveal and that work of revealing is a really critical first step, and it needs many more people involved than just artists and designers, people from across fields.
Precisely, yeah, and I need to correct myself. You're absolutely right. I think that one of what seems to be in a kind of wider landscape of image production and all the kind of explosion of both generated and designed images of architecture, in particular of architectural futures, there seems to be a kind of general lack of literacy around where the pictures come from, what they hold, in like what kind of ideological subtext they are proliferating, and also what their kind of moral integrity is, moral, let's say, claims. And I think that the work that you're describing about is so engaging with the kind of system level of the analysis of these sort of political underpinnings within infrastructures and systems and technologies is profoundly important step towards that. But then the question is precisely the involvement of constituencies in sort of adding to that process of analysis, critique, testing, rejection, or criticism of whatever is under discussion. Another thing that I was thinking about recently is I was in a conversation with somebody about tonight's event, and we were trying to imagine, or we were trying to kind of discuss, we were trying to identify what were the tropes, what were kind of the defining tropes of, let's say, futurism in cinema, for example. And cyberpunk appeared to be maybe one of the last sort of original, sort of monolithic genres, although it's by no means a homogeneous genre, but it is somehow seems to be still the lingering sort of imaginary for our planetary future, with all the dystopian and sort of all the moods that come with it. And then I was wondering if maybe we have sort of transcended the notion of tropes or genres in that sense, and that there is perhaps a more evasive, not genre specific, but there are perhaps other kinds of themes that define our near future, that capture it actually, but that can be, that have been explored across a range of periods and genres. For example, the idea of the neo-feudal or neo-feudalism, which you might say is equally contemporary, whether it is Game of Thrones or Hunger Games, or let's say Neuromancer, right? There's a similar narrative structure, or there are similar claims being made. And I'm not saying that is the perhaps even the dominant narrative, but I'm just trying to pose the question of whether or not we are able to accurately circumscribe defining horizons of our future. And there are probably multiple. Of some of them have to do with artificial intelligence, obviously, and other technologies that are enveloping us and pervading us and piercing through, penetrating us. But there are probably others as well. And do we have the tools to capture them accurately You know, that's an open question to all of you.
We have the tools we are talking about, like shaping of tools is starting with conversations, right? And I don't know, I mean, the tools, they depend, they're so specific in the field you're working in. So I don't think there's one answer to that. I don't know, you might be most equipped on a philosophical level to think about that. But
Well, I mean, yeah, it's a great question. It's a huge, have a whole other event about that. I think the one thing I would, as a note that is on my mind is thinking about just even plot structures and like the traditional kind of a Western Joseph Campbellian hero's journey plot. Number one, I mean, many scholars have already written about this. It is a totally inadequate plot structure to think about any of the crises that we're in today. And so there was a really interesting paper I read, I cannot think of the author's name right now, who was just, kind of debating about other narrative forms from other cultures and traditions and histories that are better equipped, such as, like in Indian epics and other and Chinese mythology and like other types of structures that have from beyond the West, from indigenous traditions, other places in the world, that are just, you need to think about entirely different plots, not just different tropes, and entirely different narrative structures, scales, temporalities. So that's pretty interesting. That's like a wide open field, I think, to explore, and I hope more and more storytellers do.
Nora, I feel like you have something to say about this.
I'm processing.
Maybe to bring this back to Adam, I think that this also might open up interesting questions, generative questions about presentation and what kinds of genre or kind of typology the presentation falls under. If I may, I feel like the way that Pacific Design Center Gallery has become quite a classic sort of display. Classic also in the sense that it sort of harkens back to, it kind of amplifies the kind of Neo-Egyptian form of the building itself. It makes the most out of its kind of tomb-like form and structure, and you're kind of entering this triptych on the second floor after passing through the research station. There is a very classical, almost like chapel-like, let's say, encounter or organization of content, and what you're encountering really are sort of different kinds of entities or narrative registers that may or may not be considered supernatural or superhuman or somehow certainly other than human. Whereas, for example, the SCI-Arc gallery, where we have also a research station in different configuration, but we have Angelica Lorenzi's and John Cooper's work that really are in conversation as a form of, I would argue, shrine. There is something almost sacred in the kind of the way that space feels, although there's not necessarily a kind of sanctity in that religious sense implied, but there is a mystification as a strategy going on there. There's a mood, there's a mystique. And I wonder if that might be also a way of kind of thinking across time and across cultures. What are the spaces that enable us to kind of step into a different mode of perceiving and communing?
I think you framed the whole talk today through the oracle, right? And so it's what I'm thinking that in this discussion, I'm not a futurist or a historian of science or anything else, a mere architect, but I do think that there is something important in the way that we think about future, that it's not driven by technology. And I think your parable at the beginning about the oracle and walking through that starts to hint at that. And again, not to go back to the 70s, but I think about a lot of thinkers like, here in the States, like through the New Age, a lot of people like Ray Kurzweil, or I know we're not allowed to talk about him, but like Solari, and a lot of these people that, were speculating on space, right, as a way of achieving some sort of personal enlightenment or, let's say, communal enlightenment or community enlightenment that had very little to do with the actual technologies, right? Someone breathing methane emanating from the earth who could tell the future, that's not a technology, that's something that's found, that's something that's already there, right? Breathing is not a technology, right?
You could argue that, yeah.
Well, I mean, Sloterdijk argues that argues this really well in Terror from the Air, right? That the ultimate weaponization was weaponizing the metabolics of a person, right? That the act to weaponize breathing, right, is the kind of apotheosis of technology, and yeah, there's something to that. I don't think visualizing a future for me is a way of understanding a future, and it's not to say that we shouldn't do that, right? Our job as designers, curators, artists, writers, whatever, is to speculate. I just don't know why that has to be driven by any technology or the ability of packing more terabytes, or more pixels into a screen. He's come back to Sam Weber's Mass Meteoras, right? Where he talks about the future, like television is the future, not because it's a technology that's the future, but because it always presupposes the next thing that you're gonna watch, right? When you change the channel, it's already playing. You just didn't know it yet. And that's the most immediate future. And that's a kind of failure, as opposed to Keatler, right? Who talks about, right, analog media, right? And analog media is not being a media of a future, but it being a media of the past. And I'm always gonna come back to that. Yes, everyone should keep making work and projecting ideas, but I'm always gonna come back to, it's your metabolics, right? It's the Rilke's seams of your cranium, right? That somehow reveal something. And so it's not to discount any of the work. It's just to say, I just don't buy it. That's not my future or the future that I think for myself.
Nora, you had something I thought was very generative to say about the audience of the future being a kind of generative or inceptive force. Could you speak a little bit more? Is that something that could get us out of this impasse that Adam is pointing to?
That's great.
Well, that concept is actually from a filmmaker, Victor Ricci, who did Spirit of the Beehive, and then there's an interview with him where he talks about filmmaking and the way he makes films is it's not for anybody watching right now. It's for an audience he can't expect. It's for a future audience. And that drives every cut, every frame, every edit of his film. So I come back to that often. And, before the panel, we were talking about what do you call the camera in, is it like the 5-tiered?
The 5-axis film rig. Yeah,
the 5-axis film rig. I mean, the reason I spent so much time with it is because it felt to me like an exhibition apparatus that captures something that's really hard to find language for, which is the ability to see everything everywhere all at once, which is like the eye in a game, it's an eye in a simulation. And for me, I return to technology not because I'm interested in this or the devices or the newest update, but it's because of all these experiences we don't have language for. Like over and over again every day, you find some new experience that you can barely wrap with words. The headline based on a fake AI image that then produces policy, then the image is shown to be false. Like, what do you call that memory based on a fake image that has produced real action in the world? And so we're using 20th century language for 21st century, maybe 22nd century experiences. And so I guess the tool it's always going to be language, narrative, a new lexicon, but it more collectively forged the way that hopefully this discussion is doing, and not coming from one master, one voice, one mind.
I just want to push back slightly on
Great.
that.
Yes,
Because
please.
I actually don't think that 21st or 22nd century problems are any different than 8th or 9th century problems.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's where I go back to I think technology has almost no agency in a discussion of the future, right, in the way that we're discussing it right now, right? That whether it's AI or whether it's some guy printing propaganda like on his Gutenberg press, it's no different. And so I would
We
just,
should debate this after. Yeah.
Well, no, I'm excited. I would just push back. Like, I don't, yeah.
Can I bring in one additional thought about tools? You asked the question before, and I was like thinking about this, like or structures. I think the circular structure for me, narrative structures, circular narrative structures that are ancient, that keep, and they are surrounding us and they're with us. And I think rather than straight thinking in either direction, I think the circularity of thought is really fascinating, and is something we can learn from our ancestors way back, right? And those ancestral practices really of telling stories that find a loop, that find loop in generations, and also we see that history is repeating itself and things like that, right? So then there's so many layers of thinking about circularity that I find interesting when thinking about the future in a weird way.
I think that's a great note to end on.
Absolutely.
On loops of futuring and nonlinearity. Thank you so much for staying with us, and thank you to our speakers.